Okay, so we're going to just jump right back in where we left off, or at least where I think we left off. So video 2 was winding down with adaptive radiation. So we're just going to kind of backtrack a little bit. If this overlaps some, I apologize. So just to kind of sum up and wrap up our adaptive radiation. Remember, we were talking about the finches, and so we had these finches that initially came from the mainland over here to island 1, where we had speciation occur. Then some of those finches then migrated over here, where we had speciation then occur. Okay, so now we had species B. We had species B over here. Species B flew to this second island, okay, which eventually then became species C. Okay, species C could have come over here to this island to then speciate into species D. Some of them could have come back to the original island. Okay, same here. Once we have speciation occur between islands 2 and islands 3, species D then could have come back to island number 2, could have come back to island number 1. Okay, then it could have speciated again at island number 1 into species E. Okay, so see, we have a wide variety. We end up with a large variety of birds on each one of these islands. So as they have radiated or spread out amongst the islands, okay, they have quote-unquote adapted, okay, and we've resulted in a new species. The example with the finch usually revolves around their beak and their food sources. So on the various islands, they had various selection pressures. So keep in mind, remember, our top 3 reasons why we have speciation, okay, would be the founder effect. Okay, so I have a stylus, but I don't think it's any better. Okay, so we've got the founder effect. Let's try that to write that again. Okay, so founder effect. We also have the varying selection pressures. Okay, so things like the food source, the environment that they're in. Okay, so we have the various selection pressures, okay, as well as the differing mutations. Okay, on the various islands, one population may have had one type of mutation that another one did not have. And so that allows for the variety in speciation. Okay, I promise I'll get better at writing. You might just have to watch me type, because that is terrible. So let's now take a look at how speciation occurs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how speciation will occur then. Okay, because remember, speciation, we're forming a new species, so they cannot produce viable, fertile offspring. So let's take a look at a few of the things that will prevent them from producing viable, fertile offspring. And we have 2 kinds of barriers. We have what are called prezygotic barriers, okay, and postzygotic barriers. Okay, so prezygotic barriers would be these barriers that occur prior to the zygote forming. Remember, a zygote is essentially a fertilized egg, okay, when the sperm and the egg have come together. So a prezygotic barrier would occur before that ever happens. A postzygotic barrier would occur after the zygote has formed. So our first prezygotic barrier that we have here is ecogeographic. Okay? And an ecogeographic barrier is one essentially where the organism is now too specialized for their environment. Okay? The example we have here is these 2 trees. Okay? And so we've got the sycamore tree and the oriental plane tree. And these 2 trees can produce offspring. They can produce a fertile hybrid. Okay? However, the sycamore tree is so specialized to hit its habitat, and the oriental plane are so specialized to hit their habitat. When those trees form a hybrid, their children, their hybrid trees, cannot survive in either habitat because they are too specialized. Our second prezygotic barrier would be habitat isolation. Okay? And with habitat isolation, we have exactly what it sounds like. I've got 2 organisms that live in 2 completely different places. So in this instance here, I've got one organism here that lives in streams. So one bullfrog lives in the stream. Okay? This other bullfrog essentially lives in puddles. So they live in 2 completely different places, okay? Which results again in our habitat isolation. So these 2 are never really going to come in contact with one another, so we don't have to, there's no chance of them ever producing offspring. Okay, our next prezygotic barrier is called seasonal or temporal isolation. That's what you guys would have heard it as when you were freshmen. We talked a little bit about temporal isolation. And so with seasonal or temporal isolation, we have these organisms that will breed at different times of the year, during different seasons. So in this example that we have coming up here, we've got these frogs. And these particular frogs, okay, they all breed, if you'll notice, at different times of the year. And so as they, when the wood frog is ready to find a mate, okay, it's not going to mate with a tree frog or a bullfrog because they're not ready to mate during that time of the year. So that prevents them from having their own, from having offspring together. Our next form of prezygotic barrier would be behavioral isolation. Okay, and behavioral isolation is exactly how it sounds. Okay, if I have an organism that to attract a mate does a certain behaviors. For example, very commonly are the birds that will dance or do a mating call. Okay, in this particular instance, we have a fiddler crab. They will kind of wave their arms around and they will bounce up and down. Okay, and if you're not a fiddler crab, you're not interested in that. Okay, so the particular behavior that attracts a mate. We've had a lot of examples with frogs so far. The rana frog there are different varieties of rana frogs, and they will have their own mating call, and so they will not attract other species. Okay, another prezygotic barrier, okay, so we have a large number of these, would be mechanical isolation. Okay, and our mechanical isolation, again, exactly how it sounds. Mechanical isolation, the two do not fit together. Okay, they physically are unable to mate with one another. For example, we have here these two snails. Okay, and these two snails, if you'll notice, they actually physically do not fit together. So they are mechanically isolated from one another. Our very last prezygotic barrier is what's called gametic isolation. Okay, and so gametic isolation has organisms, sorry, the iPad does not understand science. Okay, so with gametic isolation, you've got organisms where the two gametes are unable to fertilize one another. Okay, the example we have here are these starfish. Okay, and these starfish, they look like fireworks. Okay, but when these starfish, there's two different starfish here, and when they release sperm and eggs, those two sperm and eggs are unable to fertilize one another. Okay, there are certain proteins that are on the sperm that need to penetrate the egg. Okay, there's protein receptors on the egg, and those two are incompatible. Okay, so just taking a look real quick, these are our prezygotic barriers that we have so far. Okay, we've got our Geographic, again back to those two trees that are too specialized for their particular environment. Okay, we've got our habitat isolation. Okay, they don't even live in the same place. Okay, we have our seasonal or temporal isolation, okay, as well as the behavioral. Okay, remember our seasonal, they mate at different times of the year. With our behavioral isolation, their mating call, their dance, whatever it is, it does not, it's different for the different species. Okay, then we've got our mechanical, where they don't even fit together, okay, as well as our gametic isolation, where the two gametes are unable to fertilize one another. So those are our 6 prezygotic barriers. Okay, so let's switch gears then over to a postzygotic barrier. So when we're talking about our postzygotic barriers here, we're talking about barriers that happen after the zygote has formed. So our first postzygotic barrier would be a developmental barrier. So in this instance, we've got two organisms that are able to breed. Okay, they come together, okay, and they're able to breed. The example we have here is a sheep and a goat. Okay, and so what happens though is they do not produce a viable embryo. So in this instance, the sheep has 54 chromosomes and a goat has 60 chromosomes. So their chromosomes do not match up. So that embryo is actually aborted before offspring is ever formed. So that would be a developmental barrier. So that's a post-zygotic barrier. Our next post-zygotic barrier, we're going to talk kind of about two of these at the same time. Okay, so we've got two post-zygotic barriers that deal with the hybrid itself. So we have hybrid, well, we have three, but let's talk about the hybrid inviability. Okay, so here we have, there's a tobacco plant, and this tobacco plant is not viable. Okay, it will not, and so we need to think a little bit about what viable means. Okay, and so viable means that it will survive. Okay, it will be successful. Okay, and this tobacco plant does not flower. And so when this tobacco plant does not flower, it is unable to reproduce. Okay, so hybrid inviability. Okay, it doesn't make it to a reproductive age. Okay, we also have hybrid sterility. So in both of these instances, you're producing a hybrid. Okay, and a hybrid inviability, it's not going to make that hybrid will not make it to reproductive age. In hybrid sterility, you may have a very good hybrid. The example we have here, okay, is our horse, okay, our donkey, and that results in our mule right here. Okay, and so, okay, so there's our mule. So we have the horse and the donkey, okay, and they produced a hybrid. Oops. Okay, so they produced this hybrid. They produce that mule, but that mule is infertile, and that's a great mule. Okay, it can do a lot of great, wonderful things. Okay, it's very strong. Okay, organism, but it is unable to reproduce. Okay, so it keeps the donkey and the horse as two separate species because they're not producing viable, fertile offspring. Okay, our last post-zygotic barrier would be a selective hybrid elimination. Okay, so what I have here is I have these rye plants. Okay, and so when these plants reproduce, you'll notice I've got three different sizes of plants here. And as the generations go on, okay, this plant gets selected against, the hybrid gets selected against. So here's the original parent. Okay, here's the first generation hybrid, here's the second generation hybrid. They're becoming less and less successful. They are less and less fit. Okay, and so the hybrid offspring can result, but it is selected against. It has a lower fitness, so it is selected against. So it is not a favorable situation here. So these are our post-zygotic barriers. Okay, so just kidding. Okay, so let's review which ones we have real quick for our post-zygotic barriers. Okay, so we have our, we have developmental. As well as the three that are here on this page. Okay, so we've got post-zygotic developmental, hybrid inviability, hybrid sterility, as well as selective hybrid elimination. Okay, so the very last thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about speed or tempo of evolution. Okay, we've got two basic choices here, okay, as to what's going to happen with our speed of evolution, two kind of schools of thought. We have the gradualism theory versus punctuated equilibrium. And so both of these you should have heard about in your freshman year. Okay, so gradualism, just like its name says. Okay, so with gradualism here, I've got a long periods of slow, kind of steady, uniform change. So this is my gradualism model here. Okay, slow, steady, uniform change. This would favor that anagenesis. Okay, if you remember back from, I guess that's probably in video 1. Okay, so this would favor anagenesis, where that ancestral species, eventually becomes wiped out. Okay, as we have the slow, steady progression to the new species. Okay, it's very hard to tell with this when speciation actually will occur. Okay, our other form is the punctuated equilibrium. Okay? And punctuated equilibrium is a more long periods of stasis or no change, okay? And then very rapid periods of change. So in this instance here, I have my punctuated equilibrium model. Okay? And punctuated equilibrium will favor that cladogenesis, like we talked about in the first video, where we get an increase in biodiversity because we have the budding happening. So the ancestral species is never wiped out. Okay, so we have an increase in diversity. Okay, so there's very little change, long periods of little change right here. That's where it's staying nice and flat. Okay, that's our stasis. Okay, and then periods of major change, usually due to some kind of environmental crisis. Okay, the fossil record actually supports both of these, so it is very difficult to say definitively one is better than the other. Okay, so I think our 3 videos kind of wrap everything up, and I will see you guys tomorrow.